Since the rise of modern self-help culture, fiction is often looked down upon. Within my generation, there are but a few people who actually see fiction as something you can learn from. That's because it's frequently seen as pure entertainment. And while reading a book for just relaxation is fine, I personally believe that fiction, alongside being enjoyable, is highly beneficial. Furthermore, I believe it would be profoundly detrimental to the human species if the importance of great fiction were forgotten, and if it were degraded to mere entertainment. That's why I want to make the case for the value of fiction and explain to you why it benefits us. To do this, I'll first explain to you how fiction affects us compared to non-fiction. Then, I'll tell you how to discern which fiction is the most valuable, after which I'll explain how the systems behind their value work, and finally I'll give you some practical advice. So let's get started. How fiction affects us, because it oftentimes doesn't feel very life-changing. Good non-fiction can lead to immediate aha moments when you learn something. But when you read fiction, you don't feel like you've learned something immediately. You've just simply followed along with the story. But that's where the magic happens. Following along. There are well-established fMRI studies. These are studies that show which parts of the brain are active, that show that when we read a story, our brain partially activates the same regions that will be active if we were physically or emotionally experiencing what the character in the story experiences. In other words, our brains are imitating what the character in the story goes through. Regions involved with hearing, vision, bodily sensation, movement, emotion, all partially light up when reading stories. This doesn't mean that the brain confuses reality with fiction, but it just shows that deep subconscious biology is active when reading fiction. On the other hand, when reading non-fiction, the brain activates mostly language processing and analytical reasoning. With this, I'm not trying to prove that fiction is better than non-fiction, but just that fiction works in a more subtle way. Non-fiction is useful immediately because it speaks to conscious reasoning. Fiction works quietly, using the subconscious and more reflective, deep layers of the mind. Now, my belief is that when parts of our brain continually imitate the characters in the story, we are also learning, but just more quietly. We start to learn from the characters' ways of living, acting, and responding to the world, even when we don't consciously feel this. It's no coincidence that watching a hero confront evil can leave us deeply stirred, or that young children learn courage, loyalty, or even self-sacrifice from their parents telling them stories instead of giving them advice when they're just 5 years old. Now on to the next subject, because there is an important distinction to make. Now that we know how fiction might affect us and how we might actually learn from it, we must choose which fiction to read. For from fiction, we want to learn the most virtuous path in life and not be led astray. And so we must choose wisely. There is one primary determining factor in evaluating fiction, and that is, of course, time. Stories that contain deep truth endure the test of time. Those that don't fade. We, as an entire civilization, stop reading them ourselves and thus not recommending them to others or our children, so they slowly die off. Given some time, only the most true stories stay popular and stay alive. That's why works like The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Chronicles of Narnia, or even 1984 continue to move people. When using the test of time as a means of sorting fiction, we've already eliminated most weak fiction. But there is another type of fiction which I want to draw to your attention. For this type of fiction already qualifies due to its age, but it has something extra up its sleeve. And I'm talking about fairy tales. Most people assume that fairy tales are only a couple of 100 years old, but that's only when they were first written down. In reality, most fairy tales have existed for thousands of years. Most of them existed as oral traditions, passed down from generation to generation. Due to this personal retelling, Details changed, but the core patterns remained. Over time, fairy tales produced what is called archetypes. And I want you to remember this because this concept is crucial. Now, by archetypes, I mean recurring roles or deep patterns of human life. Examples include the hero, the mentor, the shadow, or the sacrificial innocent. The hero leaves safety, confronts evil, suffers, and returns transformed. Think of characters like Harry Potter or Frodo from The Lord of the Rings. The archetype of the mentor offers guidance but does not walk the path for you. Think of Gandalf, Dumbledore in Harry Potter, or even Yoda from Star Wars. The archetype of the shadow is something like disrupted desire, chaos, or even evil in itself. Here think of characters like Sauron, Voldemort, or the Joker. And as a last example, I chose the sacrificial innocent. This is a character that willingly suffers for the sake of others. Here the greatest metaphorical example is Jesus Christ, but you can also think of characters like Neo. At this point, a common objection often arises. These archetypes that you speak of aren't real people, but I want to draw your attention on this concept. For this objection relies on a narrow understanding of truth. This isn't to be taken personally though, because this concept is never really taught in school. The understanding of truth that you get from school is mostly limited to scientific or historical truth. But with a story, this is different. A story can be factually untrue, but structurally true, and thus be a meta-truth. Take the easy example of Harry Potter. Harry Potter didn't really exist as a historical figure, that much is obvious. But the pattern Harry Potter embodies, the courageous hero who accepts suffering, breaks rigid rules for the sake of the good, and chooses love over power, has occurred millions of times throughout history. Not necessarily in entire individuals, but also in little actions. We can embody Harry Potter in our life in little actions where we battle evil courageously. Therefore, fiction does not tell us what happened once, it tells us what happens again and again wherever human beings live and act. In that sense, archetypal stories are not less true than scientific facts or non-fiction. They are, in a way, hyper-true. Not because they describe facts with historical precision, but because they describe patterns that occur across human life consistently, and thus have thousands or even millions of facts supporting the fiction. I drew this out here. Here you can see fiction, which is an empty circle, which means that it isn't true, but it has all these occurrences which are colored in, which support the fiction. So in this way, fiction is a summary of all these occurrences, and thus be a hyper-truth. Saying that this doesn't hold any value would be like denying the truth of any summary you make, because they can never be the real thing. To get back to why this is so insanely valuable, as I've told you, when reading stories, we unconsciously learn. And so when we learn from fiction, we are learning from millions of experiences across human history. We are learning from the good archetypes what to aim at, how to confront evil, and how to deal with adversity along the way, and so much more. And we are learning from the bad archetypes, like the shadow, what not to do. This way we always learn. Okay, to sum up, fiction is often seen as mere entertainment, but research shows that we often imitate the characters in the story in our brains. If we read enough, our subconscious is able to learn from the way the characters live life, act with other people, what they aim at, etc. And this becomes extra valuable when we read the best types of fiction. That is, fiction that has withstood the test of time, old classics and fairy tales. Continual exposure to this fiction, that is, fiction that contains the deep human archetypes, leads to a well-developed unconscious understanding of how we ought to live. So, in my opinion, fiction is both enjoyable and educative. In conclusion, my final advice is simple. Don't be afraid to spend time reading fiction as education. It may not feel immediately useful, but it quietly trains imagination, character, and long-term moral vision. And as a final note, fiction is also highly relaxing. So we don't merely learn from fiction, but we also get some well-deserved rest. A rare case where these don't exclude each other.